This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
Claire, I want to understand a bit about you first. Your background is community radio. Tell me how you got into that. You're still in it, in fact.
I am still in it. So I broadcast at PBS FM in Melbourne every week. I've been there since I was 15 years old. So I've kind of been one of those
15.
people. In fact, I started broadcasting prior to that. I had a situation in high school where the local community radio station was set up in a little portable in this regional high school that I went to. And so I started doing the breakfast program there, and that was year 7, I think, and then moved down to Melbourne when I was 15 and found PBS, and I just have hung around there ever since broadcasting. And I don't know, it's a music-based station. So I think for me that's been a real home base in a lot of ways, partly about my connection with media, but also about the roles that I've had within the music industry as well. And I get really excited about helping people find new music and things that are happening a little outside the mainstream in that space. And then that's kind of echoed across a lot of the rest of my career since.
One of the things that's interesting about you for me, I think, is that you've not only been very invested in the content output and, you know, audiences and exactly what they're consuming, but also the commercial output. But let's talk about LINA first and your current role. So Local and Independent News Association. Tell me about that job and what it stands for and what it means.
Sure. So LINA started really operationalised about 2 years ago now. So it's come out of a space where what we've been seeing is the closure of a range of different regional newsrooms in particular, but newsrooms right across Australia that have really struggled under the commercialisation of their news and those audience shifts. And so there has been a lot of newsrooms closed down over the last 10 years or so. And in the wake of those closures, what we're seeing is this kind of grassroots movement now of people setting up online news services, and that's really coming out of people who have, either been made redundant from a local newspaper or, during COVID moved from a metro city to a regional area and then got there and thought, hold on a minute, there's no local news here, or people who are really community minded and motivated to provide a service for their communities have been starting online news services, but they were doing it largely on their own. We've identified around 100 or so of those types of newsrooms who are doing public interest journalism as a service to their community. And so LINA has set up really to be an industry association that brings those people together so they can learn from each other and just be part of a network that can generate some economies of scale on, the really unexciting things like the defamation insurance, and what you have to do at tax time.
All those things, yeah.
Right? Because if you've trained as a journalist, you don't necessarily have that kind of business knowledge as well. So it's information about that sort of the unsexy side really of running the business, but then it's also about, well, what are the business models and how can we learn from that? And because people are doing it in a hyperlocal area in their patch, there's no disadvantage from their sharing that information with people in other areas who are operating in a different space. And what we're finding is if you're the only journalist who's producing a professional public interest journalism in your region, then being connected to other people who are doing a similar role somewhere else is really valuable.
I want to talk about why that's so important, because
Sure.
I think it's easy for audiences, our listeners, to go, oh, well, do I need my local news? In fact, and there's been a couple of reports out just really recently. So 150 news outlets, local news outlets primarily, have closed since 2019. There was 106 that closed between 2008 to 2018, so the decade prior. So the acceleration of those closures is very, very real. What does a world look like without local news? Talk to me about the actual problem here.
The problem, I think, is twofold, right? So there's one thing that's about the diversity of voices and perspectives that we have in our media landscape, right? And the concentration of media and the syndication of media, and whether that in fact serves local communities. Like, are people getting the information that they need, and are they getting information that's relevant to them? And we've seen that, at a macro level really around the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of the information that was coming through was national or statewide, but people suddenly needed to know what was happening in their 5K radius, like where could they go, what clinic was open, all that sort of stuff. That suddenly becomes very, very localised. So I think that's a really good example.
And just to explain that, when you talk about syndication, so for example, if you live on the south coast of New South Wales, Fairfax, what was Fairfax is now 9, provides the news service there. You might log on to, say, like the Bega District News, you get maybe 3 stories from Bega, and then you'd get a whole bunch of other stories from around New South Wales. You might even get one out of Queensland. That syndication that's what you're talking about.
And there's a place for that news, right? People need to know international news. You need to know national news. You need to know what's going on around the rest of the state. But also what that means is if you're only getting kind of 2 or 3 stories that are relevant to your area, what are you not getting that isn't being covered? And a lot of times that is the public interest news stories around things like what's happening with the local council. Is there any court reporting happening in your area? What's going on with the schools and all of the things that make a community what it is? The converse of that is that also, you're not getting stories that are coming out of those communities either that get shared across the rest of the country. So it's a little bit like, all politics is local. Well, like all news starts somewhere too, right? For example, Tasmanian Enquirer has done some fantastic investigative journalism around some of the salmon farming, offshore salmon farming in Tasmania, and have broken a number of stories in that area and environmental concerns and things that then become national news. But someone needs to be on the ground to actually know that that's happening for us to hear about it in any other spaces. And the same thing happens around diverse perspectives. If you're someone who's living in Bega or somewhere else and your experience is not being reflected in any way in the national dialogue, then we've got a really flat kind of conversation, really. We're not getting the perspectives that actually represent the communities and the society that we're living in.
Absolutely. I think we had Annabelle Hickson, who you might know from Galah, on a few episodes ago, and she said it's a really good time to be a bit of a crook counsellor or a bit of a dodgy policeman because who is watching? The thing that interested me the most about what came out of that report is that the desire for local news is actually there. So Australia is very underserved when it comes to local news, and we are one of the most challenged nations in the world when it comes to local news. But what that report found was that people have an appetite for it, and they're recognising that I don't have that. That's a gap for me. I'd like a bit more crime reporting out of my local area. I'd like to know a bit more about my town. But how do you make the business model stack up for your members? How do they keep doing what they're doing?
Oh, look, it's absolutely tough, and that's why
you don't have to know the answer. I mean, this is what you grapple with every day.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what we're working on. So, and it's not the same for all publishers either, right? So there are different business models that work in different areas depending on kind of the density of population in that area, depending on the socioeconomic demographic of the area as well, which, when we go out to do, say, a fundraising campaign saying, hey, contribute to your local news outlet if you can, well, people's capacity to do that is very different in different areas as well. So in terms of the solutions for monetizing news, that's not the same across
everywhere.
All areas. But what we look at is kind of what's best practice and what people can try, and supporting newsrooms to test and trial what works for them and what works in their areas and what is within reach, particularly for newsrooms that might be operating with a really small number of staff, So a lot of the publishers that are members of LINA are operating with kind of 5 staff, for example, and that might be 3 full-time people and 2 part-time contributors or something like that. So it's a small team, and what we look at is how do we help build their capacity to test out different monetizations, and how do you do the advertising on your website well, and those sorts of things. And as I think people who have started out in that space, there are some people who bring to it a fantastic array of knowledge around business models and revenue growth. And then there are people who've come to it with a communications or reporting background who just want to share the stories. Who just want to, just want to tell the stories of the people in their area. And are then like, okay, great. So how do I put pre-rolls on a video, And so it's helping them understand how to do that. That's the role that LINA does.
Seems like there's there's the ad model. There's obviously reader contributions and the local community getting behind these publications and supporting them by paying.
Yeah.
Or you're looking at a government-funded model. And I'm interested in what your ideals. What's your ideal scenario for this? A bit of a mix, maybe?
Yeah, I think it does need to be a mix generally. And I think, again, it differs because what we're seeing is market failure in a lot of areas where, for example, a town of 30,000 people is big enough to have enough news to warrant a local news service, but not necessarily big enough to maintain one in terms of the number of people who can actually contribute anything to it. And even in terms of subscription models and things, the amount that people, and this is in the digital news report that you were talking about before, but the amount that people are actually willing to pay for news is really interesting, you know. So it's something like $10, maybe $20 a month. You have to have quite a lot of people to contribute that to equate to a wage for someone to live on, you know, and that's for one person or one journalist. And so I think it does have to be a mix of a range of different things. And we're seeing newsrooms go into spaces like running events and things like that as well, or looking at other ways to kind of monetize those skills as well as the news outlet, really.
As well. How do you attract younger audiences to local news? Are you hopeful about that?
I think there's a really good opportunity around that, actually. And I think because I think there's a lot of younger people who are a little bit tired of the news, right? And I think partly that's about the way it's being presented, right? So we're seeing some really interesting reporting going on, I think, in the local news space that does actually respond to what audiences are telling them, because the reporters who are working in this space are being told what their community want all the time, right? They're being told at the supermarket, they're being told when they go for school pickup or whatever, they're being told online, and they're really engaged with their audiences and really able to be responsive to it. So I think what we're seeing out of that is a really kind of personalised sort of news services evolve, not just about news personalisation in terms of tailored content for individuals and looking at individual preferences through the data, but also just that kind of personable type of reporting, which is still public interest journalism in a lot of spaces. But I think there are opportunities there. And interestingly, I think once we're able to engage more of the younger audience, they're the people who, I guess, have grown up with subscription TV more so than older generations who are used to having things for free. Their data is showing us that younger people are more willing to pay for a subscription, but how much they can pay is a different story, you know. So it's this dichotomy about people being willing to, but do they have the money, you know?
And I'm interested then, I think what you said is that LINA in particular is channel agnostic as far as the publishers that you have as part of your network. But I think sometimes for people listening, the definition of journalism is murky these days.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you define public interest journalism?
Look, there's no amazing sentence, right? And this is something that people across the globe have been grappling with.
Question,
right?
Claire.
It's a huge question. So it's that thing about you know it when you see it, but you also know it when you don't a little bit. So from our point of view, publishers who want to become a member of LINA do need to commit to a set of professional editorial standards. And then we also, in terms of public interest journalism, it is, you know, it's in the title to an extent. It's you know, it's news that is in the public interest. So it's partly about entertainment and information, but it's also about, you know, the political reporting, and it's also about going that kind of into the investigative journalism space. And so we would expect to be seeing a mix of that, I suppose, across the publication, rather than you know, you could do a whole broad range of news around, I don't know, plants, for example, or anything that you're interested in, and that maybe that's news in a certain area, but is it in the public interest? Potentially not. It's more a hobby type of publication, for example, or a business publication. But I think what we look for is whether people are really covering those things that are quite community-based news.
Community-minded. Yeah, that makes sense. Before I ask you to get into those case studies, Claire, another report found that Nordic countries have a high proportion of local titles being paid for online. You've got a couple of examples of, you know, local news publications in other countries on your website I was having a look at. What are they doing right? Because I said earlier that Australia is probably the most challenged when it comes to local news. What are we doing wrong, or what are they doing right?
Look, I think the conversation around the subscription model is really live, right? We just had we had our national summit in April, and we had a debate within the LINA membership about, you know, to paywall or not to paywall, really. And it was very interesting because there are pros and cons either way, right? And so a lot of the LINA publishers have taken the view that news should be accessible and that news should be free. And I think a lot of people in Australia do take that view. I mean, we've got a really strong ABC here, which is a free service. Obviously, not free entirely. It's paid for by
the taxpayer,
but
yes,
but you know, like you're not actually paying a subscription to the ABC. So I think people have that as a base level where they expect to be able to get the information that they need and want for free. That's not the same in other countries. Like not all countries have a really strong government broadcaster in that way. Not all of them have a community media space as well. Australia is quite unique in the way that our licensing structure works for medias. But I think as well, you know, in Nordic countries as well, there's a very strong kind of public good sentiment, I suppose. You're talking about countries there where people are paying a very high level of tax, you know, where their level of education are quite high as well. So there's often a correlation between, you know, people's level of education and their willingness to pay for news or their engagement in the political news space as well. So that's possibly explains part of that in the Nordic countries, but there's no kind of single solution in this space really, which is what makes it really hard to kind of go, here's the silver bullet that will solve subscriptions or will solve kind of the monetisation of the news space.
Yeah, it does seem to be a particular problem for us, for the UK. The US seems to be, this challenge is not as hard, as difficult. Maybe it's scale as much as anything, more people, more money.
The US does have a different operating environment to an extent, partly because of the polarisation of news over there. So people are very willing to pay for things that reinforce their confirmation bias, which is problematic in itself. But the other side of it is that they really have quite a strong not-for-profit news sector over there, which Australia doesn't have. In Australia, we don't have deductible gift recipient status for public interest journalism. So what that means is that we don't have the same recognition within our tax structure of public interest journalism as a public good as they do in other countries. And America is quite strong in having the philanthropic community back a lot of their news outlets.
Is that something you'd like to see?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would really shift the dial here.
Interesting. Tell me about a couple of the LINA members.
Sure.
Yeah. Like who's exciting? Like who's really exciting you at the moment?
There's some really exciting things that are happening, you know, every day that we're seeing different things. I was mentioning just before the Tasmanian Enquirer, you know, so they've in the last couple of weeks broken a story around, it's actually a really devastating story around some of the salmon farms in Tasmania killing off seabirds and things there. But you know, the fact that they knew about that made it become national news like within 24 hours of them breaking that story. And I think that's really exciting to be able to go, here's something that's happening off the shore of Tasmania that nobody's watching. And because there was a local news outlet there that was like, you know what, this doesn't seem right and we're going to look into it. Then next thing you know, it's on the national agenda. We're seeing examples of myth busting all the time. Like, you know, one that comes to mind is the Illawarra flame. Recently was seeing some misinformation floating around their community around there's wind farms, offshore wind farms happening in that area. Right?
Yeah.
And there was this report circulating that it was interrupting, that they had the potential of interrupting the migration of whales going up the south coast.
This has been a huge story.
Right? And so it's been... it was being reported that there was, again, a Tasmanian university had reported all of this and that, you know, this was what was going on. It turned out there was no report and the whole thing was just fake news, really. And so it was the Illawarra Flame that looked into it and was like, all right, well, we're going to speak to the academic about it. Oh, wait a minute. There's no actual academic who wrote this. The report's not real. It's just been
So the whale thing's not real?
No.
I've heard the whale thing.
Right? So it turns out there's no report. And so, you know, like
this is
that changes the conversation, right?
Yeah.
It changes the conversation because it was just misinformation that was circulating largely in social media in that area. And it took the local news outlet there to look into it to go, no, it hasn't actually come from a reliable source. In fact, it's just someone who's put a logo on a piece of paper and there's no academic who's backed that up. But then I think, you know, as I was mentioning, we had our national summit recently. We held that in partnership with Newsport up in Port Douglas. And I think their coverage earlier this year around Cyclone Jasper and what was happening on the ground there was phenomenal and, you know, did actually save lives. They had, you know, they were reporting live on people who were stuck on roofs and able to get immediate support to those people and able to get helicopters there to take them off the roof of their house, you know. So when you're thinking about, you know, does reporting have an impact? Like in that instance, yes, and within 30 minutes, you know, and not just, I think, within that 24 hours that the cyclone was happening, but then everything that happens thereafter when the community is rebuilding, like which businesses have now reopened, who's got the coffee, who's got, who's got the cleaning supplies, where do we go for clean water, all of those sorts of things that were happening in the weeks that followed. So when we see that happening in a local space, the people who are still living there are still reporting on, okay, well, now we're having a community meeting to figure out what needs to be rebuilt and what roads are reopening and all of that. That's the follow-up that doesn't necessarily happen when it's no longer the headline story in a statewide or in a national situation. So I think we see that, I see that as a really exciting and positive thing that local news brings to the table around that community building element of it. It's this piece of knowing who's in your neighbourhood and who can help.
What is the biggest challenge? Like, if what is the biggest problem right now? And can people listening do anything? I guess is probably the big question.
Well, I think the biggest problem really is the scale of things that are happening in different areas and the capacity of the industry to cover it, really. And beyond that, I think the commercial model is a massive challenge, right? And those things are inextricably linked. How many journalists can we pay for? Can we make it a secure career for people? And I think, yes, we can, but for how many people is a different story. And can we be on the ground to cover all of those stories in different spaces? At the moment, the answer is no. We've got news deserts all over the country, really, that of areas that are underserved for local information. And partly that's because the commercial model doesn't necessarily hold up in areas where, there's either not the population density. And
so the subs model doesn't work.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in a lot of spaces it doesn't. But then, so really, I guess the scale of how much news there is to cover is a huge challenge, really. And then being able to find enough revenue streams to support that and make it sustainable is a huge and ongoing challenge for everybody involved in this space, and that's why we've seen the newsroom closures that we have.
One of the big things going on for our industry at the moment is the threat that Meta might remove news entirely from their platforms. It's one part of a lot of problems. How is LINA approaching that?
Look, I think as much as possible, it's good we have the tools and the capacity to curate your own range of information in a lot of different ways and to go direct to the news sources that are providing information that you want to get. So I think in terms of what LINA's doing in that space, we're working with our publishers to help build newsletter strategies and to look at, things like apps and also just engaging audiences direct with websites rather than relying on community building on a space where the algorithms are quite opaque, right? The business model that goes with social media platforms means that we don't necessarily know or have control over what information is being shown to whom. And that's obviously a commercial model from those businesses. But what it means is, as a publisher, you're not directly engaging with your audience. And as an audience member, you might be getting 1/10 of the information that's actually coming out from any news publisher. And so people are just seeing less and less of it. And the fact that they're still seeing the occasional story, I think, is a dangerous space to an extent because it makes people think that they're actually still getting news content, which they are, but only a very small amount by comparison to what's being published and also what they could be getting. So that has been a change, and it's a change that the news industry really has no control over, really. And so I think in terms of the way consumer behaviour goes from here, it'll be really interesting to see whether that shifts people into being more proactive about going, well, you know what, I'm going to subscribe to this newsletter.
I'm going to sign up to the newsletter. I'm going to listen to the podcast. I'm going to download the app. And this is what we're encouraging, of course, our audience to do. But
individuals can do that, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's something you can do, and it costs nothing. You might end up paying. You might really value the content that much that you then go, you know what, I'm going to actually pay for this. But the first step is just seeking out those other channels. Claire, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate.